Good afternoon, everyone. Hello, my name is Giles Bailey. I'm a policy advisor at Via Nova, a mobility management company working across Europe. As part of our industry engagement and thought leadership work, we've been running a series of webinars on the most topical mobility issues. This is the 10th, and the others are available on our website. While shared micromobility has been implemented in many global and European markets, some of the most comprehensive, well-integrated, thoroughly considered and researched services are in Northern Europe in cities across Scandinavia. It is the home base of some of the larger service operators as well. After another successful summer season of operating and developing in the shared micromobility market in Scandinavia, what can we say are the lessons learned from this vigorous local market, and particularly, what lessons can be applied to other regions of Europe? How has data-led insight helped shape the Scandinavian shared micromobility market? How are the expectations and reactions of users to these services, other transport services, and public and private stakeholders changing the market? These are some of the issues we hope to explore in the next hour during our webinar in order to provide insights to the market in Northern Europe, but across the continent and more globally. We have an exciting panel of 4 speakers, and I'll introduce them shortly. But to start us off, a few thoughts for context. Again, historically, Scandinavia is a leader in sustainable transport. Some of the best services, well integration, working across public and shared micro and private micromobility. And particularly, we're seeing a lot of investment in new services in the major cities in the region. There is also widespread success in micromobility, both private and shared. This is leading to innovation, new user cases, new services, however, also leading to a number of challenges, as we can see from some of these photos, particularly in Oslo, where we'll hear from later on in the webinar, but also great innovation, which is obviously very positive to see. So how are these lessons, though? How can they be applied to the wider market across Europe, the growth in micromobility in many parts of the continent, and particularly looking at the post-COVID mobility scene, how are some of these lessons influencing how we think about mobility as we come out of the pandemic and reevaluate transport and transport services? And finally, recall that the global context really remains about delivering robust, sustainable transport systems that meet climate change commitments. This is the context and focus in which we really need to think about what we're doing in mobility and deliver the services that, again, reflect and deliver against this agenda. So we're going to have 4 short presentations, roughly about 5 to 7 minutes from each of our speakers. And after each presentation, there'll be a short kind of question and answer with myself. We'll go through all 4 speakers, and then we'll have a chance to talk across the panel, but also hear some of the questions and comments from the audience as well. So please type your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll work these into the conversation later on in the webinar. And at the end, we'll have final thoughts from panelists before we wrap up within the next hour. But firstly, I'd like to introduce Christina Mogard. Christina is the General Manager for Norway and Finland at Voi Technology. She is joining us from Oslo. Christina has been at Voi for the last 2 years. Previously, she worked for over 4 years, specializing in consulting, specializing in management, process improvements, and technology. Christina, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Giles. Is the sound okay?
Yes, it is. Go ahead.
Brilliant, brilliant. So thank you so much for the introduction. And as Giles says, I'm the lucky general manager for Voi in Norway and Finland, which may be smaller countries, but when we're talking micromobility in particular, it's big countries to keep an eye on. So especially in Norway, we've seen a hyper-utilization the last 2.5 years, and also Finland has been the country this year that have seen the biggest growth. So it's 2 really interesting countries to be a part of. But today, if you go to the next slide, Giles, What we'll quickly run through is a quick update on who Voi is, micromobility, why and why now, and then thirdly, what did we learn this year as one of the bigger operators in Europe. So go to the next slide. Next slide. Or it's loading. There we go. Last slide. Sorry, Giles. There we go. So an important one to note here, and as Giles, you also said, is that today we're going to talk about the Scandinavian success in micromobility. But it is still a hot topic of interest and great discussions. So it's loved by many, but it's also important to note that this love and this crazy demand has also caused some key challenges for the Scandinavian markets, in particular when we're talking about infrastructure and being able to keep up with the crazy demand and the speed that we see. So today I will try to zoom out and look at the bigger picture of micromobility and of e-scooters, and hopefully at the end of the presentation, the end of the webinar today, you guys will find micromobility and e-scooters as hot as we believe it to be. So if you go to the next slide, Giles. Next. Just a quick note on Voi. So we are this Swedish company founded in 2018 as the first European operator to establish its operations. In 2.5, almost 3 years just passed, we are now operating in 70 cities, and we pledged not to be the biggest European player, but be the one who has the most long-term integration and partnerships with the cities that we operate in. And we also want to be number one in every city that we're in with regards to the fleet efficiency and the utilization of the fleet. So if you go to the next slide, I want to show you some really, really interesting and cool data. So we talked about hyper demand and hyper utilization, and especially the Nordic markets, but also Oslo in particular. So Oslo has been really put on the map the last 2.5 years with its massive demand of e-scooters. And this map shows how and where the e-scooters have been used the last 2.5 years in Oslo. So to put the numbers in perspective, we have conducted 11 million rides in a city where we have a population of about 700,000 to 800,000, which means that we're on a single day doing more trips than the tram, who's been operating for more than 100 years. And that's quite massive. And we also see for Voi in particular, we have 700,000 downloads, which means that more than 72% of the Oslo inhabitants have actually downloaded and taken a ride with Voi. So there's something about these e-scooters that are really fitting a problem to solve for the population and the citizens of Oslo. Next. The graph we see here is that this is not unique to Nordics, to Scandinavia, to Norway. This graph shows the number of rides that we have conducted in total of the European landscape the last 3 years. And as you see here, the graph is pointing one way. So it took us 7 months to get to the first million rides. And after that, we've seen a massive increase and a massive growth throughout all our markets. Next. It's a bit lagging. Next. A lot of pictures, so it probably takes some time.
It's your micromobility slides, so I'll just go to the next one beyond that.
Yeah, it goes to the next one.
Okay, it's just lagging slowly.
Yeah. If we get the picture, one picture down, one more to go.
There it comes.
So the previous slide was the lead-in to these two photos. So the question that we should be discussing is why this crazy adaptation of e-scooters and micromobility now? And what problems are we truly trying to solve in our cities? Well, I've been living in cities my entire life: Bergen, Oslo, Stockholm, San Francisco, Dallas, Texas. And I dare to say that we have a really, really big issue when it comes to how we've allocated space in our cities today. Emissions, pollution, congestion, stress, these are some of the issues that we really, really need to solve for. And we see that cities in a different speed have gone to that journey, and they see that something needs to be done. The picture on the right is a mock-up of the 15 mini cities in Paris that I think is familiar to many of you, where we've seen drastic grips and improvements when it comes to infrastructure, where the aim is that everybody living in Paris should be able to get to where they are in 15 minutes with safe, sustainable modes of transport, bike, e-scooters, and micromobility. This is something that we see more and more in Europe, and it's the right way to go in terms of solving for what is on the next slide, which is a massive issue when it comes to how we're transporting these short trips in the cities. We see that 60% of all trips are below 10K, and these trips are often taken by cars and taxis, and these are the trips we want to replace. Next. So what we deemed out to do is that we want to enable the 15-minute cities. We want to make sure that citizens reclaim the city space away from cars, and we want to do this. We initially set up to do this with the first last mile transport, but what we've seen after COVID that is really interesting is that we've also become a full mile mode of transport, where most of our rides now actually happen on monthly passes, which shows that these are not only trips that are taken as a first last mile to public transport, but actually as a mile a service to get their full trip. Next slide. So why the takeoff now of micromobility? Next. One of the things that we see very clearly in the markets that have seen this crazy utilization and demand is that back in 2018, our tech was ready. Because note that companies like Voi, we are operating a hardware and a software company where we are super dependent on technology to be working with us. So 4G, 5G is an example of enablers of how well these scooters are being operated. And in 2018, this was ready. And we also see a clear tendency that the markets that are used to taking use of these digital tools, like the apps, are also higher uptake and downloads versus other markets that are less tech friendly. Next. And you see it in the demand for the user as well. Take Norway again as an example, where we've seen a crazy adaptation of people wanting seamless app-based solutions. And they're wanting app-based solutions that get them to where they are, to where they actually want to go. And they want it on demand, when and where they want. This is not unique to e-scooters. It's a trend we see in every sector. And we also see another shift in the user adaptation in terms of fewer people taking their driver's license, which is both a great saying that this is really shifting what the users and the citizens are demanding of transport need, but it's also a challenge for us because fewer and fewer of our riders have actually taken their driver's license and have less knowledge of the traffic rules, which is something we need to tap on. Next. What we're also seeing a clear correlation with is the cities that have a proactive and green policy in place and really favor alternatives to the cars. In Oslo, that I assume also Rune will talk about, we've seen massive effort when it comes to bike lanes, when it comes to parking spots removal from cars, when it comes to taxation to make it less attractive to take the car when you're going into the city center. Next. We're also seeing the requirement of a door-to-door services, given it food delivery, flexibility again, and that the original take from public transport is not really solving all the needs that we have today. Whereas an e-scooter, for example, is taking you door to door, which is also a mega trend that we see in the cities. Next. It's thus not surprising that when the Swedish newspaper Dagen Industri was summarizing the last decade, they summarized the decade of Greta Thunberg, Kardashian, Twitter, and Voi. Because this is the impact that the e-scooters have really had in the space in the Scandinavian countries the last couple of years. It's been a hot topic with a massive, massive impact in short time. And I've added the scooter standing up because that's the pledge for the next coming years, that the scooter should always be standing up. It's a little hack there. Next. So what we've seen is that the technology and demand is truly there. But some of the challenges we're facing in the Nordics and facing in other markets as well is that the infrastructure need to be able to keep up with this speed. And we're seeing increasingly cities allocating parking spots and more bike lanes, scooter lanes in the cities, but these things take time. And this is one of our main challenges today. Next. However, having said that, remember that the operators are tech companies with great muscles, use of data. I would dare to go as far as to say the first true digital mode of transport ever. And this we need to take advantage of also when it comes to solving key issues such as parking, for example. One example that we can talk a little bit about later is the parking cop that we launched this year. We asked our riders to take a photo at the end of their ride, and then we scored the parking. And we find users that had a bad parking, and we nudged users where we see they attempted to park nicely, but didn't really go in accordance with what the requirements were. So what we've seen, and the graph on the right is showing that the decrease that this worked, and that we see a decrease in the bad parkings in the city where we implemented the parking cup. So it's just one example of how tech can help solve this while also waiting for more infrastructure. Next. Another key concern for us in the learning is safety and traffic rules, and especially enforcement of the traffic laws. But just a note on this one as well. The e-scooters have adopted such as slow speed zones, no riding zones that enforce traffic laws. However, this is not unique to other mode of transport. The picture on the right was this summer when I was lucky to take a jet ski in Croatia. And then the guide said to us, okay, when you now get closer to land, this jet ski will actually slow down its speed automatically. And this is an example of geofencing and the same technology that we have in the e-scooters. But we're just first to be regulated with it in other cities. And the same goes for the electric cars and the Teslas. They have the same technology that we do. And my question thus is, if this is a way that we can ensure better traffic safety and enforcement of it, should we not require the same out of all transports that have this possibility? For example, slow zones outside of school and kindergartens? Question mark. Next. What I hope to see in this photo I took outside of my apartment in the street of Oslo, an area called Frogner. And this is an area where it's a lot of fancy cars. And what we hope to see, and what we are seeing with the massive demand, is that the alternative to the right there, with the fancy coral car, is becoming less attractive and less popular versus the coral on the left. So we hope that in 2021 and 2022, it will be as cool to ride an e-scooters as it will to be riding a coral fancy Ferrari. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina, and some great insights and points in there. I'd just like to ask you specifically, though, can you talk, I mean, there are many, many questions, but I'm just going to choose one in particular. Could you tell me a little bit more about the differences you're seeing between the larger cities in Scandinavia and some of the smaller regional markets? And again, that probably quite insightful for other markets across Europe as well.
I think what we're seeing in particular, if you take Norway and Sweden, for example, as examples, we see that it's in the smaller regions, it's also easier to get in place what we want to get in place, which is a close collaboration between operators, public transport, and the cities. So given the size of the cities, these collaborations are easier than what we're seeing in the capital. So in the capital, you've seen more and more operators coming in. In Oslo, for example, we're 12 operators now, which means that we don't have the same possibility that we have in a city like Bergen, for example, where we are 4 operators that can pretty much sit around a table together with the city and the public transport and talk about the issues that we have and find solutions that the different operators are also able to implement. Whereas that becomes so much more difficult when the market is so fragmented, and it's also bigger municipalities. I think Rune will also touch upon this later on. And then you can also say, like, the hyper demand that we've seen in Oslo and Stockholm has opened, and without any barriers to entry, has also opened the door for a lot of operators to come in. And you've seen a larger fleets coming in as a result of that, and as a result of the lack of regulation of the market. So I think we're in a great position to showcase what is possible in the smaller cities, and hopefully also use that learning in the bigger cities.
Excellent. And again, we'll come back to some of these points later on in the discussion when we get all the panelists working together. But I'd like to move on to Anne Faxer from RISE, the Research Institutes of Sweden. Anne is joining us from Gothenburg. Anne is a researcher and project manager on smart mobility innovation and has been working at RISE for the last 6 years. This follows an academic career in Taiwan, Chalmers University in Sweden, as well as in Austria. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everybody. My name is Anne Faxier, as Joe mentioned. And I'm project manager at RISE, Research Institute of Sweden. And I'm specifically working with mobility solutions for goods and people. And today I'm going to talk about micromobility in Sweden. And more specifically, let's go to the next slide. Trying to give you an overview of why scooters are so popular in Sweden based on the study we did in the past years, and also the ones that we're currently working on. So e-scooters exist in more than 10 cities in Sweden. They appear not only in big cities, but also smaller ones, just as Christine named before. The number of e-scooters is still booming, and the most debatable issues here are also parking and traffic safety. And many cities are trying out different kind of measures to solve these issues, but we will come back to that a little bit later. But right now, I'm trying to give you a very brief explanation of why these scooters are so popular here. So if we go to the next one. It's exactly as Christine named before also. We did a study in 2019, and actually many operators said that the loose regulations make this market very attractive. So despite all this fact that this transport mode also does fulfill many people's transport needs for shorter distance trips, and also for a very good possible connection for public transport. So let's go to the next one. So let's try to understand what is e-scooters by law in Sweden. The Swedish Transport Agency published a study earlier this year and suggested that e-scooters should be treated as bikes. And by bikes, I mean also the same as electric bikes with motors under 250 watts. And this actually means that all traffic regulation that apply to the bikes should also apply to the e-scooters. And this gives city a hard time to regulate e-scooters because the use behavior and also use patterns of this kind of shared e-scooters are very different from the privately owned bikes, for example. But cities cannot really set up specific traffic regulations for e-scooters by law because they should be categorized as the same as bikes. So if you, for example, set up a no parking zone for e-scooters, that also means that bikes shouldn't be parking in a specific area. And they don't really want to do that because they're encouraging biking in most of the cities in Sweden. So, but we still need rules and regulations in this modern society, unfortunately. So what do we do then? We go to the next one. So here are some examples of measures that cities do in Sweden. Basically, there are two main strategy: communication and collaboration, and also data management. In Stockholm, for example, meetings between the cities and operators are held monthly to tackle issues that occurred during this specific of time. And cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö are moving from a static policy to dynamic policy, thanks to technologies such as geofencing. This is used to control the speed and also parking behavior. So you're not supposed to, they can basically circle out the certain areas to say this is a non-parking zone for scooters. So you cannot be parking, for example, right outside of in the middle of the road. Besides, there are also measures popping out that are perhaps not very popular among operators, such as setting up obligatory parking zones that we see in Solna. So the cities are trying different kind of methods that's to regulate e-scooters. If we go to the next one, right. So less regulations comparing to other countries are definitely a plus for Sweden to be one of the attractive markets, according to many operators that we talked to in 2019. This can actually be related to the use of public space is defined by stringent laws, and also the tax-paid public roads basically cannot exclude any user or transport modes. So which in its turn gives the right to scooters to drive on all the public Swedish roads, basically. So the transport mode does answer some transport needs. In an ongoing study that we're doing now, we found that these scooters might be used more for pleasure activities than for work trips. And last but not least, the free-floating model is shown as strongly preferred by users. And this doesn't only mean e-scooters. We also did a study on the car sharing models, and free-floating is really a very attractive feature that the operator can provide to the users. We go to the next one. So the big question for the society or for many people is actually, are scooters sustainable? And do they actually contribute to a fossil-free and effective transport system? In order to answer this question, we have a research project that started this year, which specifically looking into the use patterns of these scooters to answer questions such as what kind of transport modes they replace. And also we're also going to do life cycles analysis for the scooters and to answer the questions such as, are they actually sustainable? And also issues related to governance, as we mentioned before, about the parking and also the traffic safety. We're working with quantitative data from many European cities in this project, and also qualitative data that we'll be gathering next spring. So let's see what this project will bring us. And hopefully we can answer this question by the end of the project. So thank you very much for listening, and please let me know if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Anne. And again, some really interesting insights in there. And I have two questions, and I'll put them both together in light of the time. But do you think the open approach that is typified in particularly the Swedish market has led to specific innovations from the operators or the cities? So again, as openness really kind of led to new ways of thinking about micromobility. And again, also the second question is really around the tension between the open ecosystem, but actually from the civic point of view, the need for control, the need for data, and a little bit more on how you see that tension playing out in the Swedish market.
Sure, I will start with this first question. So the openness definitely is, I think is of course a very good thing that in Sweden is so open for innovation, is so people are very open also to, is not only for the operator but also for the people are they're really very interested in trying out new stuff. That's what we learned also from many different kinds of mobility pilots. So it definitely encouraged the development of how do you say, like new mobility modes to take the start, to try out, to see what's happened, just, like give yourself out there and try what's happening. But what's more important here, I would say, is also to take up what these pioneers did and trying to develop it to a permanent or to a long-term solution. Because we also experienced that after a while, after we tried out the solutions, it's very hard to talk to the authorities or even to make things moving, to incorporate it into the bigger system. For example, to incorporate it or integrate it with the public transport system and other modes of transport. So I think that's it's very good for innovation to live in Sweden, but of course you have to push forward to really make it a long-term solution. So that's my opinion on the openness and what we should work more on in the Swedish context. And another thing about the tension, of course, it's I would say it's a problem if the city have too many operators, because it's quite hard to regulate for the cities. But they don't really have cities don't really have a way to say no today, because as we look at different kinds of tools that, for instance, popular in other European cities, like procurement, it doesn't really work out in Sweden. We cannot say that the procurement doesn't allow the exclusivity. So you cannot say that we procure, for instance, like we procure Voi, and Tier doesn't allow to operate here. It's not going to work like that. The city cannot say we procure one operator and we exclude other operators. So that makes it very difficult for cities to say no to the newcomers to the market. So it becomes a very organic market to growth. So that's actually an issue that I heard from some bigger cities. That so we're still working on that. We still don't have a very good solution yet, but I hope we will be able to work out the solutions very soon.
Thank you very much, Anne. And again, we'll come back to some of these issues later on in the webinar, but I'd like to move to our third speaker, and that's Ian Sachs from Ramboll Consulting in Finland. Ian is the market manager within the Smart Mobility team and has worked with Ramboll for the last 9 years. He had previously worked as the Director of Transportation and Parking at the city of Hoboken in New Jersey in the USA. And he is a professional engineer in New York State. Welcome, Ian.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to share our perspective on the success of micromobility and e-scooters in Nordic countries. Next slide, please. I'm going to approach this from research that we have done in collaboration with a lot of partners, including about 15 cities, as well as the participants on the left here: Voi, Lime, Nacto in the US, and Polis for Europe. And generally, what we found overall in this research is that there's a lot of generic data available for micromobility, but at the time that we did the research, there weren't very good metrics to measure the success or sustainability of micromobility. There was also a significant amount of lack of cooperation and integration between cities and operators around the world. This, as you heard, the situation in the Nordics is a lot better. And then finally, there was really, to us, a clear need to establish a set of common and shared strategic goals. So that's the culmination of the work that we did last year. Next slide, please. We identified, so I'm kind of jumping to the conclusion here, but we identified the kind of 12 common goals that, some places have higher priorities than others, but these items turn out to be the ones that really make or break successful micromobility services in our communities. Next slide, please. And now I'll really fast go through those 12 items. These are structured that there's basically like a recommendation on the top left here. In the blue box, there's some KPIs that we established to kind of help cities and operators find some common ground about what's the best way to measure this particular element, and then there's some data based on the surveys and data. Sorry, there's some charts based on the surveys and the data that we conducted. In terms of connectivity, at least, obviously the goal is that micromobility should make it easier for people to get around. That seems pretty obvious. But there are competing interests, of course. From the operator side, there's a revenue and profitability goals, and from the city side, there's also the stresses from other service providers such as public transport and their concerns about ridership. Next slide, please. In the Nordic countries, there's a lot more substantial effort to make climate priority, and particularly in mobility. That's one of the key elements of micromobility, is that it does allow people to have an alternative to driving a car for those short distances, as Christina pointed out. As the technology improves and as the generations of the technology improve, at least what we're seeing is that the life cycle carbon footprint of the vehicles is improving significantly as well. Next slide, please. Equity is a significant concern. In the Nordic countries, equity is not nearly as big of a concern as in other places. Like, for example, in cities that we worked with in the United States, there's big challenges just because of the ability to afford. But even in the Nordic cities, there are challenges with the affordability, and also the location, the placement of the scooters throughout the cities. And so that's a place where operators and cities should try to find some common ground. Next slide, please. In terms of resiliency, one of the really brilliant aspects of e-scooters and micromobility is the way that it brings redundancy to transport systems. And it's kind of funny that we produced this prior to the pandemic, but could there be a better example of how e-scooters add to the resiliency of cities than the pandemic itself, when public transport shut down or was nearly impossible to use? We saw a flourishing of the use of e-scooters throughout cities for people to be able to get from place to place. And that exposure has really lended itself to this idea that resiliency, that micromobility can be a critical element to resiliency. Next slide, please. In terms of the economy, one of the interesting things we found is how micromobility makes it easier for members of the community to get to shops, to get to stores. So while there is this tension about are they parked nicely, are they knocked down, are they blocking the sidewalk, at the same time, there's a lot of benefits to those local businesses by making it easier for their residents within a certain radius to get to those shops, and probably use those shops more often than they would otherwise. We had seen that with improved pedestrian infrastructure, improved bicycle infrastructure, and of course, we're seeing it as well with micromobility. And that's a really interesting element. Next one is, of course, safety. I like to look at this one as that, when bicycles were first introduced to cities, people were probably crashing them and having all kinds of problems as well. And as the learning curve improves, the safety concerns that we're experiencing right now will likely drop. But it's still a serious concern at the moment. In fact, just recently in Helsinki, there was regulations put in place to stop the use of e-scooters at nighttime, and of course that's really controversial, because for every drunk e-scooter rider, there's probably 50 or 60 people who are getting really good value and benefit out of those vehicles, and so that's an example of a type of kind of a knee-jerk reaction that probably works against the value of this sector of this option on the mobility menu. Next slide, please. In terms of innovation, what we have seen is that people who have never used an e-scooter don't think that e-scooters contribute to the innovation of a city. But once you've had that first experience, then you realize like what a large niche these vehicles fill. This isn't just like my own enthusiasm about it. I'm supposed to be an objective third-party consultant, but the data really support that, and I think that this is something that's really critical for cities and for operators to kind of grasp onto, is that the more they communicate and the more that they attempt to try to get that first experience with people who may be skeptical, especially members of the community who would otherwise find these vehicles as a nuisance, the relationship between different stakeholders within the community shifts to a much more positive one. Next slide, please. And then as far as compliance goes, as we have seen in the Nordic cities, there's a totally different relationship between the operators and the cities because of the way that the legal structure is established. And quite interestingly, compared to the US, for example, where the rules are very strict and demanding on the operators, we see these codes of conduct that are put into play in the Nordic cities, turning out to be a very, very successful way to find common ground. It's not perfect, and there are challenges along the way, but it leads to experimentation, it leads to dialogue, and oftentimes it leads to more flexibility in terms of seeking out the best option for all the stakeholders. Next slide, please. And then finally, there's acceptance, and I think this one basically just comes down to if the community sees that the operators and the city are working hard to try to resolve concerns that are addressed by the community, then the vehicles will be more greatly accepted overall. And I think that's it for me. Okay, so finally, there's management. When it comes to the management, the one thing that we noticed is that most municipalities just don't have the resources to effectively manage these programs the way they would like to. So if the data and the relationships aren't put in place the right way early on, then it becomes overwhelming.
You had 2 more slides in, but perhaps we should.
I think
let's go
over time. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to the wrap up, because again, thank you very much. And what I'd like to ask you particularly is acceptance, management, and data. How are these things, in kind of summary, done differently in Scandinavia, do you think, than particularly the rest of Europe, particularly on the management and the data side?
Yeah, well, because of the regulations, the Nordic cities, by and large, have to kind of like hope that the operators will share the data with them, and in many ways this is okay because there's quite good collaboration going on between the operators and the cities. But on the other hand, because obviously operators are private entities and certain data components are competitively valuable to them, there are some segments of data that aren't made available to the cities where they are critical, because these vehicles are dramatically changing the way that the networks are functioning. And since the cities have this kind of overall responsibility to make sure that the network operates efficiently and best serves all members of the community, limited access to those data frustrates the ability to effectively predict and anticipate what's going to happen in the future and plan for proper implementation. In other places where there are strict regulations or licensing schemes and so forth, the cities can basically demand the data that they want. And in some places like Los Angeles, it gets so intense that there's legal battles about what data can be shared and so forth. So there's no perfect answer to that, but I think that the more that the more open the communication is, and the more willing both sides of the table or are in terms of cooperating, I think in the end it's the residents and the members of the community that benefit most.
Excellent. And that's a very nice kind of introduction to hear from our final speaker. And in a sense, it's time to hear from the city. I'd like to introduce Rene Goss. He is currently the head of the mobility department within the Agency for Urban Environment at the City of Oslo. The department is responsible for maintaining the city's transport infrastructure and built environment, and for the development of infrastructure for walking, cycling, bus and trams, etc. Rune is a civil engineer by training. He has worked with the city since 1992, and he has worked in transport and land use at the local, regional, and national level. And sorry, he's worked with the city since 2013. Rune, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your introduction, Giles, and thank you to the previous speakers. It's very interesting to hear the different perspectives. And as you said, Giles, the last 3 years, I've been heading the mobility department at the Agency for Urban Transport in Oslo. This pretty much coincides with the introduction of shared e-scooters in Oslo. So I've been so lucky to witness the birth of this revolution, and I will briefly share my lessons learned as a representative for a municipality. The next slide, please. There you are. In late autumn 2018, the national government, through the Department of Transport, made a slight adjustment in national regulation, which made way for the shared scooters in Norway and in Oslo. This made rapidly a huge impact in the city, increasing from around 0 shared e-scooters in 2018 to 5,000 to 6,000 e-scooters in 2019 to probably around 30,000 shared e-scooters in the city in the summer of 2021. Next slide, please. But let's rewind a bit. Oslo, Norway's capital and largest city. The population in the municipality is 700,000 and in the metro area around 1.5 million. Since the late 1970s, a systematic work has been in process, making Oslo less car dependent and greening transport. Walking, cycling and public transport amounts, as you see on the figure to your left, for 2 or 3 of the daily travels. Oslo has invested in an extensive public transport system, buses, trams, metro, rail, and even boats and ferries. The last 10 years, the city has ramped up its investments in improving bike infrastructure. And further on, a distinct feature in Oslo is the high share of walking. People in Oslo tend to walk as an own mode of transport and walk distances all year round. That means that the shared micromobility and e-scooters arrive in a city where people are accustomed to multimodality, moving about the city using walking, cycling, and or public transport at their convenience, and a city where the dependency of a privately owned car is gradually decreasing. Next slide, please. Since the arrival of shared e-scooters in Oslo, it has been a hot topic among citizens, politicians, and of course, the media. To your right, I have some media clips. It's in Norwegian, but you get the picture. It hasn't been a day without some coverage in the local media. One day, the e-scooter is the hero, the next day, the villain. As a city agency, our task is to accommodate for all citizens, both those who love the e-scooter and those who loathe them. And without a proper regulation in place, we as an agency have struggled to keep up. Parliament passed a new law this June, making it possible for local authorities to introduce local regulation. Subsequently, a local regulation was prepared and introduced the 10th of September, 4 weeks ago tomorrow. The main features are, as you see on your left, you have to have a permission to operate. There are maximum 8,000 shared e-scooters in the city. We have divided the city into 4 zones. Operations are due to be closed by night, and important, permission can be revoked. And at least most important, it's a temporary regulation. A new regulation is to be in place the 1st of April next year. This means that we have a trial period where this temporary regulation will see if we really succeed in regulating this new market. Next slide, please. And then, speaking from my own experience, usually the reflex as a public servant when new inventions and innovations are introduced is very reserved and often formulated with a simple no. And we assess every possible flaw, disregarding every benefit. How do we view this thingy? It doesn't fit in our traditional view. And in my department, we have various roles. We have the people maintaining the street, removing snow and sand. They will say, hey, what is this? This will be in our way. And also our traffic engineers say, what is this? Is this a car? Is it a bicycle? Is it a person? we have really problem to fit in this new mobility in our traditional view. The scooter, the e-scooter, however, is not a new invention. The picture showing is from London 100 years ago. The new thing is that through new sharing systems, the scooter is no longer a novelty for a few, but now well distributed and becomes part of people's multimodality. And speaking of the picture, the big picture is how to integrate more shared mobility forms and also integrate them into the city's transport system, where we can enhance the best feature of the shared mobility and the e-scooters and reduce the inconvenience for the public. As I speak now, somewhere in the world, a new thing is under development and will reach us when we expect it least. Could it be drones? Nah, they're already here, but something new will happen. I hope that we as a local authority manages to cope, not with a traditional reservation and no, but with lessons learned and approach it as an opportunity for even more shared, smart and sustainable mobility. Thank you.
Thank you, Rune. Excellent. And again, we're 9 minutes to the hour. We'll probably run about 5 minutes over. I want to ask Rune a question, and then we're going to open a question to all of the panel. And I'm going to tell you what the question is in a second. But Rune, I'd like to ask you about changing the mindset for innovation and mobility in Oslo, and almost how you approach that and how you got over the challenge of people's previous views or preconceptions about how things should run. And the other question I'm going to ask the whole panel is, what's the key lesson you take from the Scandinavian market and take that to the rest of Europe? What lesson would you look for the rest of Europe to learn from the Scandinavian market? But Rune, if you start off with that mindset question to begin with.
Well, what I can say is that as a city official, as a public servant, you are trained to look at things in a whole, look at the big picture, and as of that, the mindset often becomes a very conservative mindset where all change is regarded as bad in the beginning. And if we sat at this panel 100 years ago, we would probably argue about the automobile, telling about how bad that was. And give or take some years, suddenly the city planners embrace the car and the automobile. So as in a municipality, we will always be at the rear guard, not at the vanguard, unfortunately. But that is our role. But again, I think that we have to accept that changes now in this modern world with high tech will change faster than before. And that means that we have to not stay at the rear guard and let the vanguard disappear. We have to keep the pace up. So I feel that's important in my job is to be open for new ideas and try to adapt them to the city and to our role.
Excellent. And again, opening it up to the entire panel, this question of what is the key lesson, the one or two key things you'd say from your Scandinavian experience for the rest of the European market? Who would like to start us off? Perhaps Christina, since you went first.
Sure. I think the key learnings we take away is one, demand has been crazy, and demand is something that shows that what Rune is talking about, the changes we've made to our policies, our cities and user behavior has really proven and through the demand of e-scooters. That is one lesson learned. Second is that this industry also needs regulation, but we need the right type of regulation. And thirdly, I would say that infrastructure, surprise, remains the key concern for all mode of transport. Then I want to add a fourth point, which is what Rune also touched upon in the latest, and Ian also talked a lot about, which is the fact that this is new tech, this is new innovation coming, and it's coming in a speed that throughout different industries, not unique to mobility, not unique to transport, is running faster than any policymakers and any municipalities and any national governments will. And that is a key challenge that we need to solve for. What we've seen and the way forward, we believe, is through the data-led insights, right? We need to collaborate, we need to share data, because data gives you insights, data gives you learning. And there we see it's been very, very different across the different cities that we operate in, how tech savvy, how mature in terms of receiving the data that the cities are in. And then how do you get to that place? Well, you need to regulate the market, and you need to put forward also a good way for the operators to be able to use the tech and the innovation that we have available. That means capping the number of operators. And that we've seen to be an issue in some of the Nordic cities.
Thank you. Let's go to Ian. Do you like to add any more, your key lesson from Scandinavia?
I think Christina approached from a kind of a technical perspective. I think mine's a bit softer, which is that it's the open communication and willingness to collaborate between the different stakeholders, primarily the municipality and the operators, but there are others involved as well, public transport agencies, for example. That's for me the thing that kind of shines when it comes to talking about what has happened in the Nordic cities, and if you compare that to the kind of much more belligerent and aggressive relationships that have happened in other markets, and the strict regulations, the absolute banning of e-scooters in one case, or Christina had this KPI that said 0 rogue starts or 0 rogue launches or something like that. I'm assuming that means that they didn't just drop 3,000 scooters on any city without having a conversation with them first. I think that coming to the table and having open conversations from both sides and understanding each other's needs is going to lead to the most successful outcomes, and that is probably what the Nordic cities have done most successfully.
Thank you, Ian. And over to you, Anne, and then we'll go back to Rune.
So I think what is very important is the collaboration between the cities and the operators, because we do see the model here that the cities have try to collaborate with the operators, and also for the innovation doesn't only happen from the scooter side or like shared mobility side, but also for the regulation part, because we see also there's a need for both scooters operators and also the cities together to try to figure out ways to regulate use of the scooters. The operators have very good insights of how the scooters are used. The city has their mandate or needs to take care of everybody, not only scooters users, of course. So I think there's a need for innovation also from the regulation part, and that's what I think is very important to lift in a way that maybe Sweden is quite special in the regulation, but I think many countries have their own struggles when it comes to regulation and also how to manage scooters. So I think collaboration is the key.
Thank you, Anne. And Rune, your take on the question, and I have an additional one for you from the audience, and it really comes back to why are there so many scooters in Oslo? And I'd actually add another bit of how do you manage that kind of number? So you can talk about the number of scooters, but also this key lesson for the rest of Europe.
Well, I believe that one part of one reason behind the success of the shared e-scooters in Oslo was, as I said in my presentation, the e-scooters arrives in a city with a population who are accustomed traveling about the city using what transport measure which is available and which benefits them there and then. And also it's a city becoming less dependent on car, and also a population who likes to try new things. So I think that the greening of Oslo's mobility really fits in with the shared e-scooters. The main question for my department is how do we make it fit in with the rest of the transport system, making it fully with the modality. So I think that we are in the very beginning, and in the very beginning we'll always make some errors and we'll try to learn. I feel that a session like this is learning, and I do believe that come a couple of years we'll really have found the place for shared mobility, and especially the shared e-scooters in Oslo. And what the correct number is of e-scooters, should it be 5,000, 8,000, 10,000, 20,000? I don't know now, but we have to continually learn. But I feel that I'm neither a hater or a lover of e-mobility or the shared e-scooters. I just feel that they are an important part in the future transport system, which is fully green and smart and sustainable.
Thank you, Rune. And again, we're going to go 5 minutes over, but I've seen Christina nodding, and I'd like her to come back on this point of the number of devices in the city. And I'm going to ask the panel one final question and need to wrap up. But Christina, your view on the numbers.
I think there's many factors that should go into deciding which should be a great number. I think generally we should rethink the number and rather look at dynamic caps that we see some progressive looking at, right? Dynamic caps that is based on utilization, that is based on infrastructure adaptation. Because if we're going into a phase where we're tendering and regulating the market, deciding in 2018 what the total number of vehicles should be in 2020 for Oslo, I think we would have gotten that number totally off, given the speed of adaptation that we totally see. So I think we need to start with the dynamic cap, but also noting that I would dare to say a bit controversial that it's not the number of vehicles that are the issue. For example, in Oslo, we've seen that we've had 5 to 7 hotspots where the scooters are piling up because it's areas that it's hard to get to with a car, it's hard to get to with public transport. And these have been true problem areas. But then I would rather have us tackle those problem areas and rather solve for a good distribution of scooters throughout the city. So I think this is as simple as supply and demand, but also we need to take into consideration infrastructure and how quickly that can adopt. Thank
you very much. And again, I'm going to ask the whole panel one other question. And I'd like, again, probably lead this towards your wrap up for the session because we're going slightly over. But how do you see the market in Scandinavia developing in the next 2 to 3 years, based on obviously your experience up to now with what's going on in regulation and operators and so on? But 2 to 3 years forward, how do you see the market developing? And you can wrap that also around your final thoughts for, again, what you'd provide as advice to the wider community. If we start with Ian, then go to Anne, Christina, and then Rene. So Ian, you're first. 2 or 3 years in the market and your final thoughts.
I think we will see a number of additional players. Actually, in Helsinki, we just saw a new operator enter the market. I think we will see dramatic improvements to the technology. It's hard to imagine yet what those things are going to be, but I think in general we're going to see those things, and hopefully I think we're going to see kind of getting past the early bumps and bruises that come with a new technology, and the kind of the bickering about some of the fear of something new goes away, and we can really focus on true integration of e-scooters into the full mix of mobility options.
Thank you, Ian. And to Anne, your view in the next 2 to 3 years?
So of course, I think the market will grow organically, but that also means that I don't think there will be as many players in Stockholm, for example, as today. There will be, I see it so that it will be probably larger players and also, but fewer of them in certain cities. But for us as a researcher or a research institute, I think the more important question that we're trying to answer is what is the role of the e-scooters in the effective traffic transport system. So I think that will be our main goal, to understand the role of e-scooters and also to support the development of this kind of new mobility solutions that has the potential to help our cities to be more sustainable.
Thank you very much, Anne. Christina, and then Rene. Christina, you go first.
A lot of great points been said. I think spot on. We will see dramatic improvements when it comes to technology, 100%. I also think we will see new vehicles, or we will see new vehicles being adopted to the micromobility space, e-bikes, e-pods, e-mopeds, as a part of that shared mobility mix. I also think that we will see more and more collaborations and regulations that are solving for both user needs, citizens need, vulnerable group needs, operator needs, and city needs. And hopefully, by having favorable regulations in place, this will continue to be a sustainable and affordable mode of transport with not need of any subsidies. That is our hope.
Thank you very much, Christina. And last but not least, Rene, your view in 2 to 3 years and your final thoughts.
I'm probably the person in the panel not the best to voice my opinion about that. I'll use an anecdote, because in 2018 we were fearing that that we would be invaded by share e-bikes. And we saw a picture on YouTube from Sydney where the harbor was being drenched by these sharing e-bikes, and we were just dreading them. And they just arrived in Oslo, a couple of hundred, and then the whole financial foundation for that type of operation was just away. And we, thank God. And then the year after, when the e-scooters came, a journalist asked me, well, what do you think about this? And I said, it's a fad, it will go away, just as the shared e-bike. So I'm totally useless in looking into the future, but what I'm good at is taking lessons from other cities, listening to researchers, and also listening to the operators. So I'm really excited for what the next years bring. So, but I don't know what that will be.
I think that's fantastic, Rune. It's a great place to finish off our webinar. And again, we're a few minutes over, but again, I'd like to thank Rene Goss from the City of Oslo, Christina Mogard from Voi, Anne Faxer from RISE, and Ian Sachs from Ramble Consulting for joining us today and sharing some of their thoughts on delivering successful shared micromobility in the Scandinavian market. Please listen to our earlier ViaNova webinars, as well as read our various white papers and articles, which are available from our website and LinkedIn page. They provide useful information on new mobility from partners across Europe and the wider world. You'll also find us at a range of European conferences this autumn and winter. Thank you, keep safe, and hope to see you again soon. And I'll also mention there's a satisfaction survey on your screen. It'd be great if you could fill it out. Thank you again to the panel. Have a good afternoon and see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.